here are some facts about Scotland. 1/3 of Britain's landmass. Here are some other facts. 8.4% of the population, 8.3% of output. You might be noticing a pattern. 8.3% of the non-oil tax revenues come from Scotland. Spot the odd one out. 9.2% of UK public spending. This is what people talk about when they say they're being ripped off, Barnett formula, everything else. So the question is, does Scotland get more than she puts in? Answer, yes. About 10% more. Now that 10% actually I'm cheating slightly because that is giving them quite a lot of the oil tax revenues, which I think a lot of people would think was reasonable. The thing to remember in this argument is that they're not the only ones who are actually getting more at the moment than they put in. We're all getting more than we put in. Only when we talk about the UK, we call it a deficit. We don't call it a subsidy. So the whole of the country has a roughly 10% deficit at the moment, and Scotland is no different. But it's not a lot worse either. If we just go into this, this is using the Aberdeen University, not the Alex Salmond, but the still reasonably generous Aberdeen University estimate of how much the geographically appropriate attribution of oil tax revenues, over which there will be much debate if this ever happens. So on that score, 43% of Scottish GDP is coming in taxes, 53% in spending. So, oh my God, they have a 10% deficit. Compare that to opulent London, far more taxes going in, spending far less. But then, if you look at Wales and the North East, Scotland actually starts to look quite opulent. 30% only taxes versus 66% spending. The North East, even worse. If I put Northern Ireland in here, it would be similar figures. Whopping deficits as a share of their output. And actually, these being the key numbers, you compare that 10%, it's exactly the same as the 10% borrowing on average for the whole of the UK. That's the average gap between what spending is and what taxes are. So the net subsidy, if you like, this last line is just sort of what it is relative to the rest of the UK. Are you borrowing more than the rest of the UK or roughly the same? Are you kind of getting us extra subsidy? The answer obviously is London, and if you put the South East in here as well, big positive. London putting in much more than it gets out, South East also. But third on the list, those are the only two regions of the UK that are actually putting in substantially more than they get out. Scotland is the only one that actually has, funnily enough, conveniently enough, no subsidy, if you do the Aberdeen geographically appropriate attribution of oil revenue. It is much more similar to the southern half of the UK than it is to the north. It's certainly not, or it's really bang in the middle. If you look, this is just sort of roughly telling you government spending as a share of GDP and public sector employment. Scottish public sector employment and government spending is, for sure, above the South East and London. But it's not wildly above the average for the UK, and it's significantly less than the North East, Wales, Northern Ireland. So we're not talking, when we sort of think in our heads, oh, this is a country, this is a place that has enormous amounts of public sector employment. It's a few more percent of total employment. Off the top of my head, I think it's 24% of employment versus about 21. But it's not wildly more. We're not talking about a hugely government-dependent economy. Whereas when you go to Northern Ireland or the North East, it's a big difference. These wonderful, interesting questions. How to divide the national debt? Well, if you actually did it, depending on whether you do it as a share of per capita GDP or a share of population, it actually doesn't make that much difference, because we saw at the beginning those numbers are broadly similar, the GDP share and the population share. But somewhere in the region of 100 billion, I guess, would go to Scotland. Gold reserves, fascinating question. Even more fascinating, interesting question, what happens to all that money that was lent to RBS and HBOS? And yes, we would continue to have a long argument about oil and all of these questions, the nuclear warheads that are all located in Scotland, and the SNP have said they don't want any of them. as advertised, I'm not going to give you the answer to any of those questions because they just don't exist. And the same thing applies to the European question. There's various precedents for countries separating and then separately applying to the EU. Czechoslovakia, for example. Czechoslovakia also raised the issue with the UN that they actually, when they separated, they both then applied to the UN. There are no examples of EU membership remotely similar to this. So there isn't some, and Brian's right, there isn't some clear precedent that you can point to and say, well, actually, the truth is this. I think it would be done as a matter of negotiation. The presumption, I think, would be that Scotland would be able to continue as a member of the EU. Now, whether that is after a negotiation or before is a moot point. You know, the mood and the tone of discussion after the referendum will be entirely different if it has come out in favour of a positive. And that would change, you know, everyone will be, I think, at that point, extremely reasonable. I think that even applies to this idea of monetary union, the fact that Alex Salmond has now said that he would keep the pound and indeed the Queen and God knows what else. So the oldest known monetary union in the world will continue, which would mean, in theory, that Scotland would not have independence over its currency, would not have control over its monetary policy in much the same way that Portugal has very little control over its monetary policy now, or Greece, or anywhere else. I say in theory because I'm not sure even this is obvious. If you were in the make nice post-referendum world, I think it's not inconceivable that there would be members of the Monetary Policy Committee on, you know, that would be part of the deal, that you actually would be giving Scotland some power over monetary policy. I'm not saying it would happen, I'm just saying I don't think even that is obvious, because there would be an effort at that point to make this as workable as possible. I don't think after a referendum people have an interest in making it as hard as possible. Of course, they want to make it sound as hard as possible before the referendum. So, but if they really didn't have any monetary independence, and clearly they wouldn't have total control over the currency, they would only have maybe some moderate influence. That means that the fiscal independence, as we've seen play out in the Eurozone crisis, the freedom to do what you like on borrowing, would be tempered by being what we're now calling, we didn't have a word for this until the Eurozone crisis, a subsidiary sovereign. Now what that means is you're a country that that controls taxes but doesn't control currency. And as I said at the beginning, the Eurozone crisis shows that you can get into some trouble if you're a subsidiary sovereign, if you can't actually control how much of your money is printed, but you are trying to control your borrowing and your taxes. So this would sort of weaken, if the rest of the world was looking at Scotland, they would think, we don't think they have quite the room for manoeuvre that the successor UK state has, maybe a lower credit rating. So there's something to the argument that Alex Salmond, they would have a disadvantage in global markets. They would have to prove themselves in terms of their economic management. But you can overstate that. I mean, I think that not having a AAA is actually, you know, not the end of the world, although we sometimes hear different from parts of Westminster. But in terms of the actual cost of borrowing difference, it's not enormous. I think more fundamental is this sense of how would the economy fare? Would it make sense of independence? I think here, although that all sounds very bad and all sounds rather troubling that you wouldn't have control over your currency and everything else, actually, unlike the Eurozone, the UK looks like what we would call an optimal currency area, i.e. if the UK didn't exist, we might think it was sensible to have a monetary union between Scotland and England. They actually do have very similar productivity levels, as we heard repeatedly from Alex Salmond on Sunday. Labour mobility is high compared to many parts of the Eurozone. The vulnerability to shocks, i.e. are they affected by similar things at similar times, is extremely similar, much more so than, for example, Portugal and Germany. And you can see that very briefly. This is what's happened to GDP. Now, it's sort of quite interesting variation. I mean, the UK has actually had what we would call a much wider cycle. It's gone up more and it's gone down more. But, you know, those are two countries that are basically affected by similar shocks. Those are not two countries that are unrelated in how they are affected. And Scotland, of course, is enormously interconnected with the rest of the UK. 2/3 of Scottish exports go to other parts of the UK. Obviously, this is a shortened, I'm not trying to break all the use of words, but go to other parts of the UK. And that's equivalent to 40% of Scottish GDP is stuff that's sent to other parts of the UK. So you might think these were two countries that ought to get together if they weren't already together. I guess all I'm saying in any of this is that Scotland does well out of the Union. I think from an economic standpoint, if you were looking at it and you didn't know the names and you didn't know anything about the political arguments, you'd say that Scotland does reasonably well out of Union. It could stand on its own 2 feet. And to the extent that it has big economic problems, they're economic problems which broadly the UK as a whole shares. Unemployment, for example, very similar and has increased at a similar rate over the last year. But it is vulnerable to, it is going to be dependent, if we include those oil revenues in the borrowing, it makes quite a big difference. It's going to be vulnerable to the revenues falling, which obviously they are over the next few years. And I would say the more that Alex Salmond talks about how plausible, reasonable, economically sensible it would be to have monetary union but still be an independent country, the more you think, okay, but the same arguments for monetary union being manageable, being easy, well, there are also arguments for Scotland actually being part of the UK. It's quite hard to separate those two.